When it comes to weapons in D&D, not all of them were created equal, and many are considered to be mechanically subpar. On top of this, the rulebooks don't provide us much detail on these weapons, leaving us to fill in the gaps of how our weapons look and feel. Due to this lack of information, I'd like to go through and examine all the weapons of D&D to answer, what is this weapon, both in history and in D&D? How is it different from the other weapons available? And does it need to be made better, and how can we do so? For today's video, let's look at a weapon for those who value fashion and function: the rapier. The rapier is a straight thrusting sword dated back to the mid-16th century. With a blade measuring just over a meter long and less than 2.5 centimeters wide, the rapier was a light and flexible weapon, only weighing a measly 1 kilogram. Beyond that, categorizing the rapier gets a bit messy. Technically, it's a hybrid weapon, and considered a type of broadsword. It certainly wasn't as broad as a longsword, but its blade was sharpened on one or both edges to allow for cutting. With that being said, the main intention of the rapier was to perform thrusting attacks. Any modern understanding of the rapier also requires us to understand the period in which it came to be. In the late medieval and early Renaissance periods, the nature of war and violence required almost every household to be equipped with weapons. During times of war, most civilians carried some form of weapon at all times, but different authorities did restrict who could carry weapons in certain situations. In his book, War, Justice, and Public Order, Richard Cooper noted that France restricted the peacetime carrying of certain weapons in the late medieval period, including lances, bows, swords, daggers, and cudgels. While these restrictions were put in place for commoners, it was often implicit or explicit that nobles were exempt from these rules, allowing them to carry swords in urban areas as a status symbol. It's within this culture of status that civilian weapons were not just seen for their utility, but as an accessory, which influenced how weapons evolved throughout that period. Rapiers themselves emerged as an evolution of the Italian spada da lato, or side sword. Itself a continuation of the medieval knightly sword, the side sword functioned mostly as a civilian weapon, popular in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Firmly in the category of broadswords, measuring just under 4 centimeters wide, side swords were prominently featured in the Dardi school of Italian fencing. This school, originating from fencing masters in Bologna, utilized the side sword's cutting and thrusting abilities alongside offhand weapons like the small shield, dagger, gauntlet, or cape. Their general function and complex hilt designs would inspire the later rapiers that would overtake them in the mid-16th century. While early side swords could be found in civilian and military use, the rapier was part of a series of new, single-handed civilian weapons that were developed in the mid-1500s. The term itself actually originated in Spain, derived from the espada ropera, or dress sword. Longer and thinner than the spada da lato, the low weight and decorative style of the rapier made it fashionable and functional for civilians. Once drawn, its long reach and fast reaction times made it suitable for dueling. It wasn't without its faults though, as opponents who closed the distance could maneuver past the deadly point of the weapon. With insufficient cutting power to hit close enemies, it left the wielder open to attack, prompting the carry of a parrying dagger, buckler, or even a second sword in the offhand for added protection. Fencing masters who adopted the rapier began advocating for its use as a thrusting weapon, and it didn't take long for the weapon to spread to the rest of Europe. In 1570, the Italian fencing master Rocco Bonetti moved to England, bringing with him his ideas on using rapiers as a dueling weapon. And by 1600, the rapier had become extremely fashionable among Europe's nobility. As time went on, the rapier continued to evolve to meet the needs of its wielders, becoming lighter and shorter throughout the 17th century. This transitional period for the rapier eventually gave way to the small sword, a lighter and shorter thrusting weapon. Originating in France in the 18th century, the blade was only 0.6 to 0.8 meters long, and generally lacked a cutting edge. This weapon quickly spread throughout Europe, supplanting the longer and heavier rapier as the go-to dueling weapon for nobility and symbol of rank for infantry officers. The thrusting sword evolved further past the 18th century, with the small sword, épée, and foil all emerging as iterations on the rapier's original design. Despite the decline of the rapier in the 1700s, the fighting styles it pioneered were preserved through classical fencing schools. While fencing itself traces its roots to the 14th century, it was established as a sport in the mid-18th century with Domenico Angelo's School of Arms in 1763. While this school prepared its students for real combat, Angelo was one of the first to emphasize the health benefits of fencing. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, fencing associations began to appear in various parts of the world, and the first regulated fencing competition was held in 1880. By 1896, fencing had been added as an event to the Olympic Games, and it continues to be practiced competitively to this very day. The popularity of the rapier, and fencing in general, would be reflected in entertainment as well. Stage combat has been prevalent in human culture since the ancient period, but the medieval theater really propelled fencing into the limelight. Some of the most famous examples would be the works of William Shakespeare, which often featured duels as a catalyst for drama and tragedy in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. After King James's condemnation of dueling in 1615, the popularity of stage fencing declined in Europe, but would be revived in the 19th and 20th centuries. As the development of film transitioned plays from the stage to the screen, fencing continued to be featured in modern entertainment media.
I admit it, you are better than I am. Then why are you smiling? Because I know something you don't know. And what is that? I am not left-handed.
Outside of fencing and film, the rapier in the modern day serves as a symbol of rank for officers of the Pontifical Swiss Guard, though this is mostly ceremonial. Across its history, the legacy of the rapier lives on through the styles it pioneered, and remains an icon of dueling and swordsmanship to this very day. In D&D, the rapier is described as a slender, sharply pointed sword with a complex hilt. Used mainly by fencers and duelists, rapiers are deadly in the hands of those properly trained, and are considered martial weapons as a result. Introduced in 2nd edition, the rapiers of previous editions cost between 15 and 25 gold pieces, weighed between 0.9 and 1.8 kilograms, and dealt either 1d6 or 1d8 piercing damage depending on the edition. In 5th edition, the rapier costs 25 gold pieces, weighs 0.9 kilograms, deals 1d8 piercing damage, and has the finesse weapon property. As the finesse weapon with the highest damage in D&D, the rapier is already cemented as a very good weapon option for 5th edition. It's a bit pricey at 25 gold pieces, and can't be innately used with an offhand dagger, but it deals good damage, is lightweight, and can be used by strength and dexterity classes due to the finesse property. I'm not going to go through the statistical analysis of whether 1d8 would be better or worse than the 2d6 that dual-wielded scimitars or short swords could do. But even with that limitation, characters using the rapier can still pair it with a shield to get a nice boost to their armor class, assuming they're proficient with shields. If you want to use the finesse weapon with the highest damage possible, the rapier is the weapon to choose. It may not have the light property to be paired with an offhand dagger or short sword, but finesse makes the rapier available to dexterity classes that are normally restricted in their melee options. characters who find themselves equipping the rapier will be more than capable damage dealers alongside characters using other martial weapons, and it's for that reason that so many rogues, rangers, and bards favor it above all others. So, after examining the rapier, it's a competent, effective finesse weapon that excels in 5e's current system, where damage trumps all. In fact, we could leave it alone, and it would remain a fun and useful weapon, even with all the suggestions I've made to other weapons. Even with how good it is now, though, the rapier should be more than just a damage number. This weapon shaped fencing and dueling throughout the Renaissance period. That legacy shouldn't just be reduced to a simple 1d8. As such, even though we don't necessarily need to fix the rapier, I'd like to look at some suggestions on how we can keep it viable while giving it more of its own identity. My first suggestion is to allow the rapier to critically strike on natural 19s and 20s. As a dueling weapon, the rapier is deadliest when striking a critical area, such as the heart, neck, or head. And in 3rd edition, the rapier was a martial melee weapon that only dealt 1d6 piercing damage. However, it had an expanded critical range that allowed it to critically strike on a natural 18, 19, and natural 20. In the transition to 5th edition, its damage dice was increased to 1d8, but the expanded critical range was removed. If we kept 5th edition's 1d8 damage dice, but reintroduced the expanded critical range for only 19s and 20s, I think that would be a good compromise that reintroduces this feature, but doesn't severely unbalance the weapon. My second suggestion on how to make the rapier more unique would be to add a weapon property that emphasizes its role as a dueling weapon. In duels and fencing, the rapier was primarily focused on taking down one target at a time. As such, it makes sense to add a weapon property that gives the user more advantages to targeting a creature they've already struck. 1D&D adds such a property through its weapon masteries, giving the rapier the Vex property, which states that if you deal damage to a creature with the rapier, you have advantage on your next attack roll against that creature before the end of your next turn. To me, this perfectly encapsulates how duelists would want to use this weapon, using initial strikes to weaken a foe, allowing them to land that final blow a bit easier. Plus, adding advantage on consecutive strikes in conjunction with my first suggestion makes the rapier much more viable as a crit fishing weapon, which rogue players will be very happy to hear. My third and final suggestion on how to keep the rapier interesting would be to add an innate disarming maneuver. In 3rd edition, characters could attempt a disarm attack innately to make an enemy drop their weapon, but 5th edition restricts it to Battlemaster fighters or as an optional rule. By adding an innate disarming feature to the rapier through a weapon property, players and NPCs who use it will have the ability to remove a dangerous opponent's weapon, causing them to either spend an action to pick it up, or switch to a weaker weapon temporarily. As when I discussed this for the flail though, the main downside of this suggestion is that it does override the Battlemaster's disarming attack maneuver. However, disarming attack allows the fighter to add their superiority dice to the damage while using whatever weapon they prefer, whereas the rapier's disarm maneuver would require having a rapier specifically and sacrifice a damaging attack to remove their weapon. So, the Battlemaster maneuver would remain the better option while adding an alternative for characters that don't want to play a Battlemaster but still want to disarm people. That being said, these are just a few of my own suggestions on how to keep the rapier viable and fresh in D&D. If we left the rapier as is, it would remain a high-damage finesse weapon that favors dexterity classes that don't want to dual wield, and it fills that role very well. But weapons in D&D should be more than just their damage dice, and by adding in some or all of these suggestions, we can make sure the Rapier remains viable as a martial weapon while giving it some more fun ways to be used on the battlefield. But that is going to bring us to the end of today's video on the Rapier. A duelist's delight, the Rapier is already a fantastic finesse weapon in D&D. Even if we ignored all the suggestions I put forward, I would happily recommend that players use it. In fact, I'm actually using it on my swashbuckler rogue character I'm playing right now. Even with all that in mind though, we can still add things to the Rapier to help it feel more distinct from the other weapons in D&D. However, what I want to know is, what do you think of the Rapier? Do you think it's fine as is? Did you like some of the suggestions I put forward, or did you have your own ideas on how to fix the Rapier in D&D? You can let me know down in the comments, or you can discuss it on the Alt-Roll Discord using the link in the description. If you want to support Alt-Roll, you can visit our Ko-fi to leave a one-time or recurring donation. And make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon to be notified when our videos go live. However, that's all I had for you. Thank you all for watching, make sure to have a great rest of your day, and I'll see all of you next time.